You step into this with the quiet confidence of someone who believes their intentions are clean. You've spent years telling yourself you're a nice person. You hold doors open. You listen politely. You help people move houses. You lend emotional support like it's a full-time job. You've convinced yourself that niceness is your currency, and the world should eventually return the favor. But beneath that polite exterior, there's an emotional economy constantly running. A subtle calculation of who owes you, who appreciates you, and who doesn't even notice. You keep pretending your motives are pure because it makes life feel simpler, cleaner, more symmetrical. But the truth is that most of your niceness isn't altruism. It's transaction dressed as virtue. You help because you want to be seen as helpful. You give because you want to be valued. You tolerate because you want to avoid conflict and rejection. If morality were a vending machine, you'd be inserting good deeds hoping for validation to drop into the tray. And deep down, you know this. You want to be liked. You want to be chosen. You want others to treat you with the same level of care you extend outward. You want reciprocity, the silent contract no one signed, but you still expect everyone to honor. This is where the illusion begins to crack, because you're not reacting to people as they are. You're reacting to the roles you assigned them. The friend who should have been grateful. The partner who should have understood. The co-worker who should have respected your extra effort. You expect moral symmetry simply because you tried to play the good person. But life isn't symmetrical. People don't repay favors at the same emotional interest rate you charge. Every time someone fails to meet your invisible expectations, resentment grows. Quietly at first, like a subtle inflation in the value of your kindness. The more you give, the less it's worth. Because when kindness is abundant and unboundaried, it stops being generosity and becomes self-erasure. And this is where the mirror turns toward you. You thought you were good because you were compliant. You thought you were kind because you were self-sacrificial. But kindness without limits is not goodness. It's avoidance. You avoid being honest about your needs. You avoid disappointing people. You avoid the discomfort of saying no, even when everything inside you screams for it. You've mistaken pleasing others for being a good human being. Look closely. Your niceness is often a shield, a way to hide your fear of confrontation, rejection, or being seen as selfish. But suppressing your boundaries doesn't make you morally superior. It makes you emotionally bankrupt. You give so much that you expect others to pay off your internal debt. And when they don't, you call them ungrateful. But maybe, just maybe, the person you've been protecting is not the world. It's the fragile version of you who believes goodness must be earned through sacrifice, exhaustion, and quiet suffering. This is the brutal truth. You're not as good as you think. Not because you're bad, but because you've spent years confusing people-pleasing with goodness. Now forget whatever you're dealing with today. Let's walk through the truth together. You walk deeper into the emotional ledger you've kept hidden for years. The one you pretend doesn't exist because it ruins the myth of your selfless persona. But it's there, quietly calculating, balancing emotional accounts like a bookkeeper who never sleeps. You do something kind, and immediately a subtle expectation forms in the background. You tell yourself it's nothing. You're just being helpful. But your mind records every unpaid debt, the message they didn't reply to fast enough, the favor they didn't return, the appreciation they didn't voice, the gratitude they didn't show. What you call hurt feelings is often just a negative balance on your internal spreadsheet. This is the gratitude paradox at work. The more you expect gratitude, the less genuine it becomes. You start looking for confirmation that you're a good person through the reactions of others, but they're not living in your emotional economy. They don't know the price of admission. They didn't read the invisible contract you silently drafted. You help someone through a breakup. You stay late at work to pick up the slack. You listen to a friend vent about the same problem for the 6th time. But under every act, there's an unspoken invoice. See me, appreciate me, mirror my effort. You don't say it aloud because that would expose the transaction. But you feel it every time someone fails to reciprocate. And when they don't pay, you call it betrayal. But here's the uncomfortable observation. Generosity that requires a return is not generosity. It's emotional investment. And like any investment, it comes with risk, delusion, and loss. You want predictable returns from unpredictable people. You want the emotional stock market to stabilize around your needs. You want fairness, consistency, symmetry. But life isn't a grocery store where you can select the exact outcome you want off a shelf. You are navigating a system where reciprocity breakdown happens constantly. People give less than you expect. People forget what you did for them. People prioritize their own survival, not your emotional bookkeeping. And every time the ledger dips into the red, resentment forms. A quiet, acidic feeling that corrodes your sense of goodness. You start believing you're too caring or too loyal. But what you actually are is too invested in unspoken agreements no one else knew existed. Your kindness becomes a loan with hidden interest rates. And when the world defaults, you feel robbed. This is where the emotional economy turns against you. You give excessively, thinking it will stabilize your relationships. Instead, it inflates the currency of your kindness so much that its value collapses. People stop seeing your efforts as extraordinary. They see them as expected. You become the reliable one, the available one, the one who always picks up the emotional tab. But being indispensable is not the same as being valued. It's often just being used without malicious intent. People simply take what you keep offering. And you offer without limits because you're terrified of the day someone stops needing you. So you pretend your motives are pure. You pretend you just want to help. But underneath, you're bargaining for emotional security. You're trading your time, energy, and boundaries for the illusion of being wanted. Invisible contracts, unspoken expectations, emotional bills no one agreed to pay. And eventually, the resentment becomes too heavy to hide. You start seeing people as ungrateful. You start seeing yourself as the victim, and the entire structure collapses under the weight of what you refuse to admit. You weren't seeking connection. You were seeking repayment. This realization is not meant to punish you. It's meant to free you from the exhausting job of being the world's unpaid emotional accountant. Because the truth is simple. When you stop trading kindness for appreciation, you finally understand what kindness is. You step into the terrain where your boundaries used to be, or where you thought they were. This is the part of your life you've tiptoed around, the part you justify with phrases like, "I don't want to make a fuss," or "It's not a big deal." But every time you say those words, a small piece of your self-worth dissolves, like chalk lines fading in the rain. You call it kindness. You call it patience. But the more honest word is collapse. Because boundaries don't disappear dramatically. They erode quietly. They wear down through repeated compromises you convince yourself are noble. You give someone your time when you're exhausted. You agree to something you resent. You say yes because saying no feels like a confrontation you haven't learned to survive. You swallow discomfort like pills, hoping the side effects won't show. This is where emotional inflation takes over. The more you offer without limits, the less your effort is valued. You become the discounted version of yourself. Every favor becomes expected. Every sacrifice becomes routine. Your emotional labor turns into a subscription service you never agreed to provide, and people keep auto-renewing because you never cancel. And somewhere along the way, You start believing your worth is tied to how much you can tolerate. You absorb other people's moods. You absorb their stress. You absorb their needs until yours become vague, undefinable shapes in the background. You think you're being flexible. You think you're being good. But flexibility without firmness isn't kindness. It's self-erasure disguised as virtue. You keep stretching yourself thinner, hoping someone will notice the effort. But they rarely do. How could they? You never show the cost. You hide your exhaustion behind calm smiles. You hide your disappointment behind polite acceptance. You hide the truth behind the persona you shaped to survive social convenience. This is where your story gets darker. Every time you abandon a boundary, you reinforce the belief that your needs don't matter. You teach yourself that speaking up is dangerous, that being honest is selfish, that taking space is disruptive. So you shrink, you accommodate, and then you resent the world for letting you. But the world isn't letting you, you're training it. Learned helplessness forms here, in the repetition of small surrenders. You tell yourself there's no point setting boundaries because people will ignore them. But the truth is more painful. You abandoned your limits long before anyone crossed them. Self-worth erodes not through dramatic failures, but through the consistent choice to prioritize being liked over being honest. So you keep playing the role of the agreeable one, the one who doesn't cause trouble, the one who adapts, absorbs, adjusts. And the longer you play this role, the more it becomes a cage with velvet lining, comfortable enough to stay, restrictive enough to shrink inside. But here's the quiet tragedy. The people you fear disappointing aren't thinking about you as deeply as you think about them. They don't see your inner negotiations. They don't hear the arguments you have with yourself before saying yes. They don't feel the cost of every boundary you swallow. They're just living. And you're rearranging yourself around their lives, hoping it will earn you peace. It never does. Because boundary collapse doesn't create closeness. It creates distortion. It creates relationships where you disappear so others can remain comfortable. It creates friendships where you're the emotional buffer. It creates partnerships where you're valued for your capacity to absorb, not your capacity to exist. You lose yourself gradually, politely, quietly, until the version of you that remains is a softened outline of a person who once had needs, opinions, and preferences. And then, one day, you wake up, resentful, depleted, and confused about how you got here. But the answer is simple, even if it's sharp. You mistook being agreeable for being good. And the cost was everything that made you feel alive. You enter the landscape of self-deception, the quiet, intricate loops you've rehearsed for years without realizing they were rehearsals. This is where things become uncomfortable, not because the truth is cruel, but because it's familiar in ways you've tried to avoid. You like to believe you're generous, compassionate, selfless. But if you peel back the polite language, you'll see the gears turning underneath. You give, yes, but you're also negotiating, not with others, but with your own insecurities. You present your kindness like a gift, but internally it's collateral for what you hope to receive. Validation, inclusion, protection from loneliness. You want to be the person others rely on because it feels safer than being the person who relies on anyone. You want to be indispensable because it reduces the fear of being abandoned. You offer emotional labor because it lets you pretend you don't need emotional labor back, even though you do, desperately. This is the emotional economy at its most deceptive. You pay for connection with kindness, hoping no one notices the transaction. But people do notice, just not in the way you want. They notice the pattern, that you're always willing, always available, always accommodating. They don't see your internal negotiations. They don't hear the silent monologue of, maybe if I give enough, I'll finally matter. People simply experience the outcome, not the intention. And this is why self-deception feels so efficient. You convince yourself that your motives are noble, so you never have to face the actual fear beneath them, the fear of being ordinary, unchosen, or forgotten. You keep telling yourself you're just doing what's right, because admitting the truth feels like stripping away a layer of identity you've spent years polishing. But here's the problem. False generosity is a contract with invisible fine print. It binds you to expectations you never voice, outcomes you can't control, and emotional returns you never actually receive. And every time reality fails to match the fantasy you built, resentment expands like a slow burn. Loss aversion plays its part, too. You cling to the identity of the good person because losing it feels like losing the only leverage you have in the world. If you stop being who everyone expects, who are you? If you stop being the one who always gives, what remains? You're terrified of discovering that beneath the persona is someone you don't know how to defend. So you keep performing goodness like a ritual, predictable, automatic, comforting. You give more than you can afford. You tolerate more than is fair. You stay longer than you should. And every time you repeat the cycle, you confirm the lie that your worth exists only in your usefulness. This is where sunk cost fallacy traps you. You've invested years into this version of yourself. You've poured time, energy, and emotional currency into being the reliable one. Walking away from that identity feels like abandoning a lifelong project. You keep overextending because you're terrified the entire investment will collapse if you stop. But here's the truth. The self-deception loop hides from you. Authenticity isn't something you earn through endurance. It's something you reclaim through honesty. You're not a bad person for wanting approval. You're not manipulative for needing connection. You're not evil for hoping your kindness will come back to you. These are human impulses, ancient, instinctive, wired into your psychology long before you learned the concept of morality. What corrupts them is the refusal to acknowledge them. Because when you deny the truth of your motives, you trap yourself in a cycle of exhaustion and disappointment. You give your energy away like a gambler placing desperate bets, hoping one day the world will finally pay out. But life isn't a jackpot waiting to reward the most selfless person. It's a series of choices where honesty with yourself is the only leverage you truly have. Self-deception isn't a moral flaw. It's a survival strategy you outgrew. And now, it's time to see it clearly. Now you arrive at the place where the illusion finally fractures, the collapse of the good self you've been protecting like a fragile trophy. The version of you that believed goodness was a shield, a strategy, a guarantee. The version that thought morality could be weaponized to earn love, loyalty, and fairness. You've spent years polishing that image, hoping its shine would blind you to the truth underneath. But now the shine is gone. This is where you confront the mechanism you've avoided. Morality turning into manipulation, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. You behave well because you're terrified of what might happen if you stop. You're afraid relationships will fracture if you assert yourself. You're afraid people will leave if you stop overgiving. You're afraid that without your goodness, you'll have nothing left to offer. Your kindness becomes armor. Your agreeableness becomes camouflage. Your patience becomes a negotiation tactic disguised as virtue. But the most brutal truth is also the simplest. Being good for the sake of being accepted is not goodness. It's compliance with a strategy you never questioned. Look at how you navigate relationships. You hide your needs to avoid seeming demanding. You downplay your preferences to avoid inconvenience. You soften your tone, dilute your opinions, cushion your discomfort. You build a version of yourself that keeps the peace at all costs. But peace built on self-abandonment isn't peace. It's a quiet form of self-harm. The social incentive structures around you reward compliance. Workplaces praise the person who goes the extra mile, even when that mile becomes a marathon. Friend groups lean on the reliable one until reliability becomes identity. Families slowly absorb the capacity of the member who doesn't mind helping until that person stops recognizing themselves. You mistake external praise for internal worth. You mistake being needed for being loved. You mistake exhaustion for virtue. And so you keep performing goodness like a duty. But every performance erodes something essential. Every time you prioritize being liked over being real, you lose a fraction of your self-respect. Every time you suppress your truth to maintain harmony, you sacrifice authenticity. Every time you pretend you don't have limits, you reinforce the belief that your value depends on how much you can endure. This is the hidden cost of the illusion. You end up building relationships where people love the version of you that doesn't exist. But here's the turning point. The collapse isn't the end. It's the beginning. Because when the illusion breaks, you finally face the person beneath it. A person who doesn't need to trade kindness for belonging. A person who doesn't need to bankrupt themselves emotionally to feel worthy. A person who doesn't need to hide behind moral performance to feel safe. You start seeing your boundaries as non-negotiable, not optional. You start recognizing that your worth is independent of how much you tolerate. You begin to understand that kindness without honesty is manipulation, but kindness with honesty is strength. And slowly, the emotional economy shifts. You stop giving out of fear and start giving out of choice. You stop helping to be appreciated and start helping because it aligns with who you are. You stop performing goodness and start embodying integrity. The collapse of the good self is not a downfall, it's a release. A liberation from the emotional debts, invisible contracts, and psychological loops that kept you small. You're not as good as you thought, but you are far more real than you've ever allowed yourself to be. You've walked through the uncomfortable architecture of your own motives, peeled back the polite layers, and seen the emotional machinery that's been running in the background of your life. And now, as everything settles, something quieter emerges, a kind of stillness you rarely allow yourself to feel. You don't need to rush to fix anything. You don't need to rewrite your entire identity by morning. You don't even need to judge yourself. Awareness is enough for now. Clarity is enough. You finally understand that being a good person isn't a performance, a bargaining chip, or a currency to buy affection. It's simply the byproduct of living honestly, respecting your own limits, and refusing to dilute yourself for approval. There's strength in setting boundaries. There's dignity in saying no. There's calm in choosing yourself without apology. And slowly, without force or pressure, you begin to rebuild. Not from fear, not from insecurity, not from the desire to be chosen, but from a quiet, grounded sense of self-respect. Let this be a soft reminder. Worth isn't earned by exhaustion. Love isn't secured through sacrifice. And your value doesn't shrink the moment you stop overgiving. Tonight, you saw the truth. Tomorrow, you'll carry it differently.